This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Aperture Priority is the go-to semi-automatic feature for pretty much most people, and for good reason. It gives you the most direct control over how your image looks with regards to what's in focus and what's out of focus. Being able to select the depth of field and what your image focuses on is such a powerful tool in storytelling, as well as making a visually pleasing image. From a more practical perspective, I see many cameras are starting to utilize dedicated aperture dials on their lenses. Obviously, Fuji have been doing it for years, but even Sony has started to make lenses that have a dedicated aperture dial. Of course, this makes the whole shooting process a lot easier and a lot more intuitive. You can even change the aperture value with the camera switched off so that you can switch it on and already have it set to whatever aperture you need for that particular scenario. And finally, as long as your auto shutter speed and auto exposure are set correctly, we'll talk about that later on, you can shoot with peace of mind. You can literally just take photos, and the only thing you're focusing on is how do you want to take this photo? What do you want in focus? What do you want out of focus? And ultimately, what do you want the viewer to look at? This one can catch so many people out because when we buy a camera and we put it in auto, we just assume it's like an iPhone that you can go and take photos and everything just kind of works out. But unfortunately, it's not the case. Obviously, when you have your shutter speed in auto, your camera has a certain parameter within which to select the shutter speed for a given situation. However, out the box, that parameter will either be extremely low, like 1/30 or 1/100. So when you're taking a photo at night or in low light, obviously the camera doesn't know that you are hand holding. It doesn't know that maybe you're walking or maybe there's a lot of motion blur. So when you do take that photo, it takes it at 1/30 of a second and you end up with a blurry result. And that's precisely why one of the first things that we should do when we switch our camera into aperture priority is to change the minimum shutter speed value. To do this, we need to go into the auto ISO settings on the Fuji cameras. On Sony's, Canons, I'm sure you've got something similar, and within that you will see the minimum shutter speed. So I personally set that to 1/200 because in my opinion 1/200 is a very safe low shutter speed. Now while we're here, we can also set the auto ISO. So on the Fuji camera, you do have 3 separate sort of memory banks, auto ISO 1, 2 and 3, where you can set different settings. I think other cameras should have something similar. The first one has a minimum shutter speed of 1/200. It has a base ISO of 160 and a max ISO of 3200. This is my daytime auto ISO setting. The second one also keeps the 1/200 shutter speed. However, the base ISO is now increased to 500 and the max ISO is increased to 6400. If you watched last week's manual video, then you will probably understand why. If you haven't, then the reason for that is because I want to keep the base ISO high to ensure that my shutter speed always stays high if I'm always in and out of changing lighting conditions. So from very bright to very dark to very bright. And the final auto ISO 3 setting has a minimum shutter speed again of 1/200, a minimum ISO of 500 and a maximum ISO of the maximum of the camera, which in my case is 12,800. This is for those days when someone steals your recycling bin at 3 o'clock in the morning and you need to take a clear photo of them. It doesn't matter if it's really grainy and you can't print fine art posters out of it, but at least you can see who nicked your recycling bin, so then you can go there the next day and egg their house. At this point, I want to say a huge thank you to today's video sponsor, which is Squarespace. So personally, I use them as my go-to platform that is effectively a backbone for this whole entire YouTube business and for my photography. Not only is it my portfolio, but also it's my blog, it's my contact page, it's my online store, and it's even my newsletter. The fact that I can manage everything within one app on my iPhone, on my iPad, on my laptop, or from any device is a huge bonus. I'm a one-man band, and the more I do this whole YouTube thing, the more I realize there is so much admin work, and honestly, you have less and less time to actually go out and do photography, which is quite ironic. And by having Squarespace, it just takes a lot of that admin away from me. and simplifies the whole process. So if you are a business owner, a photographer, or you're starting a hobby and you need an online platform that perhaps one day you can grow into, then I definitely recommend Squarespace. If you do want to give them a go, use the link in my description and the code to get 10% off your first purchase. Again, thank you for watching this bit of the video, because if you support my sponsors, you support me, so thank you. If you watched last week's video, then you would know exactly what aperture values I use for manual photography, and for aperture priority, they don't change. So if you have seen it, then by all means skip through to the next bit. However, I will run through them again just in case. So my default aperture value that I set the camera to when I walk out the door is f4, only exceptions obviously being nighttime photography, which I don't really do anyway. Why f4? Well, I find it to be a very nice mid-ground. You get a bit of out of focus elements in terms of background and foreground, so you can create a bit of depth. However, equally, it's not completely blown out, so you do get a lot of context. Equally, it does let a lot of light in, however, not so much light that you need to increase your shutter speed to like 1/8000. Also, having it at f4 means I have 1 to 2 stops of adjustment either way. So if I do see the camera is struggling in either low light or very harsh light, I can quickly either close the lens down further or open it up without spending too much time doing so. In terms of other aperture values, I will typically shoot at the following. So anywhere between f1.4 and f2.8, so let's say wide open, I will reserve it for days when the light is very low, and obviously I need as much light coming in as possible, or those scenarios where I want to just have as much out of focus elements as possible. So typically, if I am in a very kind of wide scene, then obviously having things at f1.4, f2 can look a little bit better compared to if it was really kind of narrow and closed in. Another good reason for shooting at the wider apertures is that typically lenses are at their softest at those values. So if you do want a very soft image, then you can just open it up and get that type of look. On the other hand, I would close the lens down to anywhere between f8 and f11 if obviously there is too much light coming in and I need to help the camera. So f8 will definitely cut a lot of that out. Also, if I want the sharpest possible image, because as you know, lenses are typically at their sharpest about halfway through the aperture value. And finally is if I want to have as much background and foreground and subject in focus as possible. By this stage, we have set our aperture, we've set our minimum shutter speed, we've set our auto ISO settings. So the next thing is to assess the ambient light and decide whether the camera is exposing correctly. For this, we have something called exposure compensation. For those of you who don't know, exposure compensation is that dial that you would usually get on the right-hand side of your camera, where it goes, 0 and then -1, -2, or +1, +2, and small increments in the middle. Basically, all you're doing is you're saying to the camera, if you think this is the correct exposure, take that exposure and then add a little bit on the top to make it brighter, or take a little bit away to make it darker. So in effect, you're changing the camera's sort of base exposure depending on what you think looks better or is, let's say, more applicable to the ambient light and the conditions. There is no clear rule as to how you should approach exposure compensation with regards to by how much you should adjust it, because it honestly depends on the situation, on the light, and even on how you plan to edit that photo later. From personal experience, the only thing I can say is just avoid making any adjustments that are greater than, let's say, 1 stop plus or minus. The main reason for it is because exposure compensation should be treated as a corrective adjustment to the global exposure and not a creative adjustment. In terms of creative adjustments, there's definitely a better way to do that I'll talk about in a little bit. Now, I'm going to share with you how I would personally set the exposure compensation. However, again, please keep in mind, this is so situation and light dependent. So for normal standard daylight, I would typically have it anywhere between -0.3 and +0.3. If the light is very, very harsh and it's midday, then I could have it anywhere between 0 and -0.6. If it's a cloudy day, then I would typically have it between 0 and +0.3, sometimes 0.6. When I say cloudy, I mean like proper gloomy overcast. If it's snow, I can have it as high as +1. If it's fog, usually around +0.6. The reason for the higher values on the cloudy, foggy and snowy days is because the camera will typically underexpose those scenes because the camera doesn't know that it's snow. And obviously snow is meant to be pretty much pure white. So the camera will always underexpose. If you leave it 100% in automatic with, let's say, 0 on the exposure compensation, you will find a very gray image. These settings can be completely overlooked, and some people even fear them because they just don't know what they do. Certainly, I remember when I started, I avoided them altogether because, well, A, I just shot in manual, but B, because I just didn't know what they did. Obviously, now, a few years later, I realized that was to my own detriment, and if I started using them sooner, then I would have definitely improved as a photographer a little bit quicker. So I'm here to tell you that they are indeed very useful, and once you get your head around them, honestly, it will feel like a cheat code for aperture priority, especially when combined with the last item in this video that I'm going to talk about. To put simply, you will use the photometry settings to tell your camera how to expose. So by now you have the correct exposure. Let's say you've set it to +0.3 because it's a little bit cloudy. Well, that's where the photometry setting comes in, because now you say, okay, that's the correct exposure. However, I want you, as in the camera, to focus here for the exposure, or only focus here for the exposure. That's where these settings come in. Now, there are many different settings and different camera manufacturers can call them different things. However, ultimately, there are only 3 which, in my experience, I found to be the most useful. The first one is called a multi-metering mode. As the name suggests, the camera looks at the entire scene, the entire sensor, and then it calculates a correct exposure for the scene. Now, it does use some weird trickery, AI and all sorts of stuff to give you a balanced scene. It's not just a mathematical average, and it will prioritize certain elements such as maybe the sky being a bit brighter or the shadow area being a little bit darker. Certainly in my photography, I would use that about 70% of the time. However, there are certain scenarios where a multi-metering mode can fail you, and that is where the center-weighted metering mode comes in. As the name suggests, rather than looking at the whole scene, it will just look at the central portion of the scene. Now, let's be very clear on one thing. When I say central portion, I mean wherever your square of your focusing is, that's effectively the center. So if you take a square and you move it into this corner, then that is where the camera would look to expose. Now, the best way I can describe this is if you imagine taking a photo out of a window, typically you will end up with a, let's say, fairly well exposed window frame, and whatever's outside is blown out. Well, with a center-weighted metering mode, as you can imagine, it exposes very well for what's in the middle, i.e. what's outside the window, and the window frame will, rightly so, fall into shadow. So this is the setting that I would use if I'm taking photos out of a car, out of any window, or even if I want to take a photo through a particular gap or find a space and shoot through something. This is definitely a good setting for that. And finally, we have spot metering, which is an extreme version of center weighted. So take center weighted and condense it down to a little spot, and then you get spot metering. So as the name suggests, it literally just takes one point in the frame, usually where your little square is, and then that is what it will base the exposure on. So if you point that little spot at the tiniest pocket of light, then it will expose for that pocket of light, and everything else will fall to black. And this is the setting that I would personally use for any creative photography. So all the photos where I am exposing only for the highlights and then the shadows are all going to black is done with spot metering. Obviously, I don't use this feature nowhere near as much as the previous two because it is for very select few, let's say, photo opportunities. But when I do use it, it can be very useful. All right, we're nearly at the end and I only have one more thing to share with you, but I promise if you can get your head around it and implement it, it will feel like a cheat code for your camera, especially when coupled with the previous photometry, specifically center weight and spot metering modes. The setting I'm talking about is auto exposure lock, or AEL, as denoted by an AEL button that is found on the back of most cameras. Obviously, if you're shooting in full manual, that button's completely useless and chances are you've probably reprogrammed it to something else. However, many people that I've met on my workshops who still shoot in aperture priority never use that button. And I promise you, this can really change how you expose your photos. Auto exposure lock, as the name suggests, locks the exposure. So if you take your camera and you point it at the sky, you press and hold auto exposure lock, you then recompose and then say point the camera back down at the ground, you will find it's underexposed because the exposure from the sky is still locked in the camera. If you then go to take a picture, your shutter button still does the focusing and it will still obviously take the photo, but it will not override the auto exposure lock as long as you keep that button pressed. The moment you release the button, you will find the camera will re-expose for whatever you're pointing it at. So what does all of this mean? Well, it means that if you have, let's say, a center weighted metering mode enabled, you can change the exposure by just simply pointing your camera at an area of the scene that you want to be exposed for, locking the exposure, recomposing, and taking the photo. In other words, you no longer have to touch any dials or do any extreme, let's say, exposure compensation adjustments if you want a specific exposure for your scene. In my Lisbon video that I did, I was using this technique. A few people questioned it as well because I would point the camera, let's say, at a particular bright area of the scene, lock the exposure, point the camera back, compose, and take the shot. And that was such a liberating way of taking photos because I could literally just use 2 buttons and that's it. I'll use the auto exposure lock to set the correct exposure, lock it, recompose, and then use the shutter button to focus and take a photo. All right, that is all for today. I just want to say a huge thank you for watching this video, and I do hope you've managed to take some away. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, and even share how you expose, please write it down in the comments. The comment section is for you just as much as it is for me. So if you, let's say, take photos a certain way that works for you, just share it below and maybe someone else can learn something from you and not just from me. Right, I have waffled on enough, so I am gonna call it a day now, go and get a cup of tea, visit my mate, and catch up with him. Thank you ever so much for watching the video again, and I will see you in the next one. It's been emotional, stay safe, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.